I think the idea that technology can solve everything is not the right way to think about it, because I can tell you that most of the folks who are using technology today, they're not thinking about the technology, they're thinking about the outcome that they're hoping to get. And technology is just a tool. And that's always been our view as folks who fund builders and fund open source code, is that technology has to make things objectively better. If you are 100% reliant on that technology, it's going to be really hard to say that the system is going to improve, because the technology is going to then dictate what the users do.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ReFi podcast. This episode officially concludes season 4, the Regeneration Nexus. Today, we delve into the technology part with Wes Geisenberger, the Vice President of Sustainability and ESG at the HBAR Foundation, building out the Hedera blockchain ecosystem. From discussing the recent COP to what it takes for blockchain protocols to enable climate action, this conversation has many great layers. Let's let us do some good reflections for the ReFi space too. My favorite one was thinking about what it takes for a project to be labeled ReFi and whether it even matters, because it's the impact we should always come back to.
Totally. And what really stood out to me in this episode was how Wes revealed this quieter yet deeply impactful side of ReFi. It also felt refreshing to hear his perspective on technology, not as the end goal, but as a powerful enabler for real-world solutions. I like his approach, prioritizing meaningful systems change over financialization and tokenization, which was often the case in the early days of ReFi. This overall feels like the perfect note to end the season on, and we'd love to hear your takeaways. Let's focus on long-term impact. And thank you to all of our listeners for supporting us throughout this whole season.
Hello, Wes. Welcome to the ReFi podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, Wes. You're a climate investor and you lead the Climate Impact Fund at HBAR Foundation. And we're so excited to chat with you. And we know you just came back from COP. So, what are some of those takeaways? And can you share more broadly, how is Web3 received at these gatherings now that we're in 2024? And specifically, the role of blockchain to solve some of the urgent climate issues that we're facing?
I think COP was a really good event for us and for the industry. And I appreciate you bringing this up as kind of the first area of focus, because we as an industry need to be focused on the things that are actually going to change the world, where there's a need for public ledgers, where there's a need not just from a specific investor, but actually by folks who are trying to solve real world problems. And at the COP, there's plenty of different issues that are being negotiated as a continuation of the Paris Agreement, thinking about it not just from carbon markets, but all sorts of other issues. And as an industry, we had a lot of different forums actually at the COP that you may not think of as traditional blockchain forums or traditional areas where you hear the word tokenization pop up. But if you looked throughout the pavilions, one of the common themes was, in the carbon markets, these assets should be tokenized. Not just tokens, but actually, what about digital MRV? Digitizing methodologies, digitizing data. In the process of the COP, the carbon markets under Article 6 has a few different areas of focus. One for government-to-government markets, covered in Article 6.2 and what's called an ITMO, or an International Transfer of Mitigation Outcome, and Article 6.4, which is, think of it almost as a continuation of the Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM, but in a new, higher quality, high integrity framework for international voluntary carbon markets. What's really neat about this is there's a call for many of these markets to have a registry system. And those registry systems are oftentimes thinking about tokenizing assets. But you have to really think about, what is this asset? It's a emission reduction of some type. It has to follow a set of rules. It has to follow a set of data. Oftentimes the folks who are looking to buy these assets need to prove that these rules are faithfully implemented, independently audited. There's probably a bit of a trust issue, which there's probably a bit of data that needs to be shared across multiple parties. There's a coordination issue. And the more you break things down, talking that way, folks in the Web3 world think about, this is a blockchain problem. This is a data problem. And the folks at the COP, actually, they often get that. They're looking for new tools to build high integrity carbon markets. They're looking for tools to be able to transfer carbon credits so that folks get paid for the work that they're doing. Folks get assets that they can prove have happened as emissions reductions in the real world. And I think that's one of the conversations that, folks may not realize is blockchain's starting to go mainstream in the climate process. And it's not necessarily the thing that you hear about when you talk about other areas in Web3 like DeFi, but you start to see elements of fintech, elements of new infrastructure required for carbon markets, infrastructure required for carbon emissions tracking. We have concepts like a global stock take that probably will need some type of nested accounting. And these are all systems that haven't existed necessarily in the past. They haven't had the level of scrutiny where estimates may have worked 5 years ago, where we need more precision today. And so coming out of the COP, I guess one of my takeaways is that we have a really big opportunity for not just carbon markets, but emissions tracking and other natural capital assets to live on the public ledger. And as part of our mission at the HBAR Foundation Sustainable Impact Fund, our mission is to bring the balance sheet of the planet to the public ledger. We want to do it in a way that makes climate finance auditable. So the same accounts that live on that ledger, you can trace flows of whether it's fiat or stable coins into the same accounts that folks have that are also attesting data. But of course, test data, it has to have context. And that's where we focus on digitizing methodologies. One of the big concepts in Article 6 is what methodologies are going to be eligible for this voluntary market. There's hundreds of methodologies out there that have existed. And actually the CVM, has helped write hundreds of them. And those are all living in PDFs somewhere. It's really hard to discern what's high quality, what's high credibility. And you think, well, now there's 100 plus countries that are likely to have to implement a registry in their host country. And then they have to figure out, how do I implement all these rules? What tools and systems are out there? As part of our second goal of our fund is digitizing open source methodologies so that we actually have the playbook of how do we implement a system that traces every data point to get to a metric ton of an emissions reduction. That, of course, has to be independently audited. And there's other capacity issues that have to be built in the process of something like the COP, where validation and verification of these projects for independent auditors, there has to be capacity built in a lot of countries that previously didn't have companies based there. There's this concept called a validation and verification body in the carbon markets, effectively an auditor for these projects. And the process of the CDM was called a DOE, designated operational entity. But those independent auditors need to exist everywhere around the world so that it's cheaper for folks to be able to audit these projects so that we can get to an asset that's tradable, whether it's to a government, to a private sector company. And I think the beautiful thing is these can all be assets that live on the public ledger natively. So that's I think a pretty cool takeaway. And there's a lot of folks who are helping shepherd this forward as part of the COP process that aren't just at the HBAR Foundation and the Hedera ecosystem, but we've had folks who have actually been fighting this battle since 2017 to make sure that, blockchains and distributed ledgers are mainstream. And, you got to give a big shout out to folks like Miroslav Polzer, Alexei Shadrin, part of the Climate Chain Coalition, who have been part of the COPs for a very, very long time. They've helped lead the Digital Innovation Pavilion. But there's also folks like AIDA who have facilitated digital working groups and conversations in their pavilions, in addition to what Hedera has done with our Regenerative Finance Forum at the COP for the last few years. And so, there's a lot of folks who are trying to help make folks aware, build capacity, educate, and doing a lot of the baseline work to make sure that our tools and technologies as an industry find their way into a process where there's actually folks who really have found that they do need these tools and are starting to build them into their institutional systems.
Awesome. There's so many threads that I want to pull here. That before that, I want to make a quick follow up and ask you. I assume this is not your first call. So, how would you rate your level of optimism this time compared to the previous calls?
Each COP has its own culture, its own kind of flavor. You have in terms of the environment that it's in. There's a lot less people, obviously, in Baku than there were in Dubai. There was over 100,000 people in Dubai. In Baku, they were targeting to try to have 30,000. I've heard everywhere from 50,000 plus that attended to 80,000. And Baku's a much smaller city. But I'd say overall, there was a lot more focus on getting the negotiation done. And there was a lot of pressure on the negotiation in Baku because there was a lot of pessimism coming into the event based on the location, based on the ability to execute on what was required to get to an Article 6 decision, which we were hoping for last year in Dubai that we didn't get. This was the 9th year of Article 6 being negotiated to operationalize it. And I think a lot of folks were relieved to see that happen, and that big congrats needs to go to some of those negotiators who have been fighting for almost a decade to get this done. And I think that's a good takeaway. I know that there was more that was wanted in terms of the NCQG, the new collective quantified goal, which was an agreement for 300 billion in finance. And they're discussing it as a path to 1.3 trillion in new finance, but when they didn't quite obviously get there, that's the goal, is figuring out by BLM where new capital can be brought into the process as additional rather than potentially just repurposed. And there's some questions around the text. I think that, obviously we'd love to see more money in climate finance, but I think 300 billion is a good place to start. It's much better than no agreement, in my opinion. And that doesn't mean that it's enough. And I think that's an important element to take away. But I do think we have to walk away with some wins, and the Article 6 wins, I think, were important. And the fact that we now have a path forward through the consultations through the next year to get to deeper operationalization of the methodologies, which is an opportunity for our industry to come in and comment on what needs to be done or thought about as part of the next phase of Article 6 and the carbon markets.
Yeah, I'm curious that besides the main negotiation rooms, they're all the side events, and I believe Hedera hosted Regenerative Finance Forum at COP29 this year. And can you tell us more and how, like, who went to the side events, what kind of actors were present there, and also how is this concept of regenerative finance even received at events like COP?
This year was really, we didn't have the same expectations of Dubai when there was 100,000 people there. And it's a little easier to get to Dubai than to Baku. But what we did go in is we wanted to have a deeper focus on a couple specific areas. One, on how do we bring together institutions and have a conversation about where regenerative finance can focus on engaging corporates and things like emissions tracking, decarbonization. How do we bring the big four auditors in the room? How do we bring the Fortune 500 companies in the room that are ultimately historically the folks who've bought a lot of any type of carbon credit? Any type of carbon credit could be a carbon credit from an ETS or a voluntary carbon market asset, whether it's in a certified emission reduction or any type of VCU or other type of asset that's mostly been done by Fortune 500 companies. And we wanted to facilitate a conversation starting with the folks who buy based on the liabilities that they have and what pragmatic and practical solutions could be brought to bear by distributed ledger technology and Web3 ecosystems. And we wanted to then bridge that throughout the day to go focus on, well, where does that go into the voluntary carbon market? What types of technologies can help leapfrog? What types of opportunities do we have for countries in the global south to enable a just transition? How do we use technology to be a communications tool for folks who want to start projects that then sell into corporates who need to buy? And a lot of time we're walking a line between what's sustainable impact for a community to what is an emissions reduction because I can't decarbonize my supply chains fast enough. And we wanted to draw that line, starting with the emissions side, going into how do we create credible projects using technology. And so we started the day actually with 3 of the big 4 auditors on stage to have that conversation with one of our council members, DLA Piper, facilitating a conversation on how do we get to decarbonization? What are the opportunities for the auditors to actually take a digitized methodology that they've then audited the data for and pass that up and down a value chain? And there are some really good conversations and insights. And we actually posted all this on YouTube as part of the Hub Culture YouTube channel. And maybe we can wait to, after the recording. But those conversations are then hopefully going to lead to other discussions that are with folks in the audience who want to take that forward because maybe that's their auditor on stage. Maybe that's a company that's implementing technology for them. Maybe it's tied to an emissions tracking or ESG reporting application. And we were really happy to have folks like Workiva there with us, who's a big ESG reporting tool. We had folks like Gisenberger, who does biodiversity reporting in addition to CSRD, a big regulation in Europe for reporting and across not just biodiversity, but everything water rights, deforestation, to decarbonization as well. And looking at some of the indicators that are going to be needed to help companies not just assess their liabilities, but get to granular information that's going to be required as part of CSRD or Scope 3 regulations in California. And from there, we pivoted into a conversation we had after lunch with Vera and Mandy, their CEO, came to join for a fireside chat for an hour and to talk about the opportunities in digital innovation. One of the things that we wanted to have is an open discussion with the biggest voluntary carbon market standard to say, what are the opportunities that you see strategically? We obviously know that for a while, Vera hasn't enabled tokenization. That's a big question from and folks in the audience ask that questions directly. And I think there's some insights that they have as part of the conversation of, well, how do we use these tools to get ahead? What are the opportunities to use Web3 technologies in a responsible way? And where do they see that going? And I think that that conversation gives a lot of insight as to where not just folks like Vera may go, but folks like other standards or 6.2 or 6.4 can go. And she's 3 months into the role, and it gives you a path of maybe where does the next 3 months, next 6 months or a year look like? And from that, we pivoted into some of the types of opportunities that we could enable for folks who would be registering with registries or standards like Vera. And what are the opportunities to actually use technology to bring data to bear? What are the opportunities in DMRV, the things we typically hear about in ReFi? And how do we beat fraud? And I think that discussion was well received. We had folks from probably over 24 countries come throughout the day, which is a pretty cool global event. And most of the folks had projects. We had folks, for example, from Sri Lanka who've launched a ReFi project, and they're focusing on exploring Article 6.2 credits. We had folks like Dovu who are known in the ReFi space, but we had many others that are focusing on getting projects launched, thinking about new types of concepts that can bring capital to both the communities developing projects as well as bring decarbonization technologies to bear.
Thank you for the context, and I would like to make sure we have everything covered as well. So let's talk a little bit about your work at the HBAR Foundation, which is on a mission to obviously grow the Hedera ecosystem. So, what is the foundation's vision for the role of Web3 in addressing climate challenges? And maybe can you tell us a little bit about the general role of foundations in this space? Because this is obviously a new model. We have Ethereum Foundation, Stellar Development Foundation, Near Foundation, the HBAR Foundation. So could you talk a little bit about that particular setup as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Hedera ecosystem, which you can think of as multiple different organizations, the Hedera Governing Council actually gave a grant to the HBAR Foundation to help set up 4 funds. We have 4 funds as part of the foundation, some that you may see at other foundations in different ecosystems like the crypto economy or things like consumer engagement in the metaverse, as well as fintech. But the unique area that we have at the HBAR Foundation is the Sustainable Impact Fund. And our mission is to bring the balance sheet of the planet to the public ledger, but also to grow the sustainability economy on Hedera. And that doesn't just mean carbon credits, it doesn't just mean carbon emissions, but building an ecosystem that you can interact with both enterprises as well as individuals in better enabling sustainable development and climate outcomes. That doesn't just mean carbon markets. It could be things like the energy transition, where we have applications that are working with governments or businesses to buy and sell wholesale power, even here in the United States, or folks who are enabling water markets, where we have folks like Civic Ledger and their Water Ledger product that are enabling governments in Australia to actually manage water inventories, and that are doing the same here in the States with some state governments. And those types of applications are really enabling sustainability outcomes where you have large markets that you may not think of as traditional ReFi markets, but are actually underpinning sustainability at a pretty broad scale, where we're touching individual farmers who are maybe consuming different water rights, where we have folks like Dovu in the carbon markets who are enabling farmers to get access to finance for enabling carbon credits. These are all different parts of a much broader ecosystem that we try to support and enable through our grant funds. And so historically, when we launched the fund or announced it in 2022, we were open to all applications and focusing on supporting a growing ecosystem that was naturally existing, but really getting it focused on some of the things that we could do uniquely as Hedera. So Hedera, historically, from a technology perspective, is known for being very high performance, high security, where we have the highest form of security in distributed ledger technology. We're fair. It's kind of a unique feature of Hedera is if you can submit a transaction to any node of the network and get fair access to the network for a fair fee denominated in US dollars. And part of that is because we're governed by a council that goes across sectors and geographies of folks like Google, Tata, IBM, DLA Piper, Electricité de France, folks who you don't necessarily always think of as the household names in Web3, but they're actually the folks who have taken an equity position in Hedera, where they govern for up to 2-3 year terms, so 6 years, and they're actively participating in innovation. So they say, well, what do I need as a corporate to build sustainable use cases that also work for the individual developer to get access to a highly performant system? And one of those things is, can I have predictable fees? Can I build an application that works for a government, especially given that carbon markets, energy, and water rights all heavily intertwined with regulated regulated industries in many cases? And that's what we've been enabling, is building on top of that layer with infrastructure that allows developers to build faster, with grants to allow applications to get to market, and then scale to projects who can then get better access to finance or different outcomes that they otherwise couldn't do without public ledger technology. And that's the important part of what we do, is enabling the folks on the ground to actually catalyze change and make an impact. From a foundation perspective, though, in the market, our role has to be to catalyze change at a large scale, and to use our finances catalytic capital that can not just support every project that wants to launch a token, but every project that has the chance to change the world, and doing that in a way that couldn't be done before. I think that's a really important element. And the way that we do that in the Sustainable Impact Fund, which may be a little different, is we fund a lot of public goods. So our most well-known public good is the Hedera Guardian, but we've supported many others. And the Hedera Guardian is a tool that allows you to digitize methodologies. It's fully open source. So Hedera, from a network perspective, is fully open source. The Guardian is fully open source. When you digitize a methodology in the Guardian, or if you're a grantee of the Sustainable Impact Fund, those methodologies themselves are open source. And what we're doing is we're actually building a system of knowledge that allows anyone to get access to the market in a digital way that previously wasn't possible. And then when we fund these tools, you can get to new outcomes. For example, for the first time, standards can compare their methodologies side by side. If there's an issue in the market where you have to recalculate and it affects a large swath of an industry, say a cook stove carbon credit, which has had questions, called on integrity by academics and media, if you could automatically search for every cook stove credit that would use a specific calculation or permutation of a methodology and find the issue within a matter of minutes instead of a matter of months, that's the type of outcome that we want to enable. And then applications using our technology, they can build all types of new features that touch the individuals that are now impacted by those investigations or academia, and actually help them avoid the bad outcome, where finance goes away from projects, but gives them the opportunity to actually define, well, here's what quality looks like. And those are the types of things that we really see as an opportunity for a foundation to directly impact climate change, but from a public goods perspective upwards.
I'm curious because I do have to advocate for my ReFi folks that are going to listen. What are the grant opportunities or funding opportunities within the Hedera ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's some really cool ones. We actually just announced COP 2 new funding streams as part of the Hedera Guardian ecosystem. One is a methodology bounty program in partnership with Exponential Science Foundation. We're super excited that they put together a bounty of $5,000 in methodology for 2 years, so 25 methodologies a year, that if you digitize a methodology in the Hedera Guardian for one of the high priority areas, that's up to $5,000 that you can get access to per methodology. The second area is a community bounty program, and that's for solving for bugs and not just finding them, but actually going and fixing them in our open source code bases. And so there may be other bounties as part of that community bounty program that's focused on features or development in our open source ecosystem. But together, that's $450,000+ in open source funding on top of the funding that we do year over year for the Guardian that we've done since its inception, to the tune of millions of dollars. Now, beyond that, we actually have an application portal. If you go to hbarfoundation.org/apply, you can propose your own funding, generally built on top. We encourage it to be built on top of our digital public goods and in conjunction with them. But we've accepted all types of applications across different areas in climate sustainability, in addition to other areas of the foundation. One of the things I think we're excited about is finding ways for retail to engage in these markets, finding ways to more credibly track emissions, bring in new types of finance. And so if folks want to bring new ideas to bear, we're very excited about looking at applications, finding ways to better give communities access to sustainable finance, but also get to credible emissions reductions, whether it's in the carbon markets, in value chains, or in areas like biodiversity, where we need new business models to help support new and growing opportunities in the market.
Nice. So that's a call to action to all our listeners. Go on HBAR Foundation website and apply. But I'm curious to dive a bit more into Hedera because to me it seems like a special chain in a sense that you position yourself differently than, let's say, Ethereum and others because it's known as the enterprise grade public network. So what makes Hedera enterprise and how do you navigate this focus on enterprise versus individual? And also, yeah, can you just make the case for why Hedera and why we need public ledgers? Why you mentioned multiple times, right, that the mission is to put nature's balance sheet on the public ledger. Why do we need this?
I want to say Hedera is for everyone. And I think that's an important thing to say. Just because it works for enterprise doesn't mean it doesn't work for the individual developer. And we are EVM compatible for folks who have questions, but we also have a bunch of other tools on top of that, other services that make sense for other activities, whether it's logging a piece of information, keeping a balance, not just running a process or a complex smart contract. And when we go to enable the most difficult problems in, say, carbon accounting or energy trading, you need the level of service and rigor to know that if I'm talking to an energy grid, that the information is going to be 100% correct 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. If I'm measuring the consumption of water for my city or my region, that information has to be 100% correct because no one wants to wake up with a bad water bill. And so when you think about that from a corporate perspective, all the systems that talk to Hedera need to have a cost predictable note. So if I say I'm going to pay every time I talk to the network a tenth of a penny or a hundredth of a penny, depending on the service, I have to know that's that way every day of the week, every month of the year. And that there's other folks thinking strategically about what makes sense for the network as a whole. And that's the governing council, up to 39 members who are all running the computers of the network that own an equity share for up to 6 years, and then are switching in and out with other members of their industry. So today we have Boeing, tomorrow we could have another aerospace company coming in or appear in their industry, replacing them as part of that governance. And when we think about Hedera as a whole, Hedera has a vast amount of opportunities because of the thoughtfulness from a corporate perspective, but it's also an ability to connect to the individual developer when they want to build a tool that connects back to industry, that they know that the tool is already built on a network that has thought about a lot of these issues, whether it's regulatory compliance, whether it's fair access to the networks, whether it's different types of government certifications in terms of regulatory approvals. If you want to interact with the government system, those are all things that have been thought about. And sometimes they aren't just, hey, I'm checking a mark for government. Sometimes it's post-quantum encryption. Those types of things are really, really important. Now, when it comes to engaging someone who's coming to Hedera for the first time, I think the important thing to know is if you can do it on Ethereum, you can do it on Hedera. If you want to build something though that maybe you weren't sure if you could build it on a blockchain, we may have other tools on top of Hedera that you may not have been aware of that exist in the Web3 space. And when those tools are used in combination, there's some really cool outcomes that you can create. And so one example, I'll come back to the Hedera Guardian. We have this issue in carbon markets or emissions and greenhouse gas accounting, where the methodologies consistently change and upgrade. And the rules may not change in a predictable way every 3 months, every 6 months, or a year. And so if you take those rules and you constantly are changing them, that doesn't work terribly well for a smart contract to always have to be changed. All the data going through it has to be changed every 3 or 6 months. Maybe it changes drastically, maybe it's just a little bit, and all the data would have to be reprocessed. Now, it's a smart contract's a state machine. If the state is constantly disrupted or interrupted or invalidated, that won't be so great. But in our case, we have logging technology, almost like a message queue where you can fire data through it. You can notarize it, said at this time, this was said. And if the rules are done that way and the data is processed that way, what we can actually do is when there's a state change, effectively, when there's a rules change, we can swap out the rules, keep the data immutable. The past rules are still there immutable, and you plug in the new rules. So in the carbon markets, if your Cookstove methodology has to be upgraded, you can do that and then identify all the other issues with this new calculation. And you can tell everyone who has an asset that's tied to this issue exactly how it's going to change that asset. And there's different tools in the tokenization capabilities, which are native to Hedera, that you can then take advantage of. So if you have an NFT that represents a carbon credit and you want to put that in a smart contract for trading and an upgrade happens, you know exactly how that NFT is affected, exactly the rules if something's been invalidated, and you can use those tools in combination. So, well, what's different about that? Okay, I can drop an NFT into a smart contract for trading. Well, if it's now attached to a bunch of different information, what if I'm not just trading a static asset, but I can start to build assets and their definitions of attributes in a way that I can actually search for them in ways that the market may not see. So instead of having an asset, maybe it's a dog or a cat with all these features or attributes, maybe it's a carbon credit with all sorts of sustainable development elements that aren't considered an attribute in today's market that I'm now defining. I can do that. I can maybe even do some type of automated definitions on that, similar to how you would search for a house on Zillow for the folks who are in the US or realtor.com. But instead of being a standard set of assets, I can go define those and trade them in a way that wasn't possible before. So those are just some of the opportunities that are on Hedera. There's probably the best opportunities ahead of us aren't yet defined. And so my encouragement is to everyone who's thinking about building is explore based on what you see the market needing, the definitions that you may have on what is a blockchain may expand, and don't let that technology limit the opportunity. So
Awesome. Love that. I'm curious, Wes, and I apologize for shifting the gears a little bit, but I want to know more about your personal story as well. So how did you become, interested and passionate about the intersection of Web3, climate action, and regenerative finance? And maybe how has your perspective on these things evolved over time?
I appreciate that. And that's a long story, and I'll try to keep it a little short. I got involved in climate sustainability maybe by accident. I spent a lot of time. I was working at Oracle before I came to Hedera, and so that was about a 6-year journey that I was on. And I started to get into water billing systems and architectures and putting water billing systems in the cloud for the first time. And the second you start to get into water, you can't not get into areas of sustainability because you're getting into consumption of water, the different types of water. You're getting into billing systems, allocation, how that impacts an individual. It's not just sustainability in a consumptive perspective, but how does that impact someone's bill, who maybe can't afford it on a monthly basis. And you start to get into some of the tricky issues of civic technologies, but it also gets into how do I better manage these systems, allocate resources. And over time that evolved into thinking about emissions. I was trying to figure out the tricky problem of how do you account for per passenger miles at Oracle and designing transportation systems of what about all the empty seats on the buses and the cars as you're sitting in traffic on a highway, and what if you could fit optimally every person in the seat? I know that doesn't sound like a climate problem until you realize that maybe the majority of those seats in those cars on the highway are empty. And what if we didn't have to burn all this gasoline, or maybe we could get people onto transportation? And I started to work a lot more on that problem, which naturally became a Web3 problem. And I was at the time working with Hyperledger in a more enterprise blockchain scenario. But more and more, I kept coming to an answer that it needed to be on a public ledger because you shouldn't be able to turn off your emissions as a company or as a state with a cloud subscription. You shouldn't be able to get rid of this data, which isn't regulated in many places. It needed to be immutable, because if you are a company and you're producing a product and that product's data, which may not be considered emissions data, it could just be supply chain data, weren't required to retain it. It just becomes a liability for them. And there's a perverse incentive to get rid of information that probably is relevant to how we better manage and allocate our resources to decarbonize. And more, it became about how do we account for these assets, whether they're positive or negative assets. There's a lot of arguments about that. How do we allocate emissions to a specific party? Is it the party who's producing a product, or is it the party consuming it? And those are the different conversations I think that I found to be really important. And ultimately, I came to the realization that there had to be a public ledger where I as a company, I as a country, I as a government, I as a person could better manage this. And what I found was we needed a better way to manage our environmental data, our sustainability related data that could prove who said what when, under which rules, if they're still scientifically correct. There's a problem that we've been working on for a while in the Hedera ecosystem of how to manage that. And then could I put balance sheet in context for a company, a person, country, and anywhere in between? And it doesn't just have to be emissions, but it could be water, biodiversity, or any other natural capital asset. And that's where I've been evolving and trying to think about how we can better do that. I think the hard part is always to make it easy for the average person to understand the minutia of carbon accounting or water rights, where they change jurisdiction to jurisdiction, or a carbon offset is still too difficult for the average person to understand how is it done and how can I trust it. And I think that's, it's not just where I've come from, but that's, I think, where I'm trying to go to is how can I make that balance sheet accessible so that you don't have to have a PhD in environmental science or spend 10 years inside of a climate negotiation to understand the minutia of a specific issue. And that's, I think the journey that I'm going to continue to be on for quite a while. And hopefully that we find a way to solve so that every person has access to understanding our impact on the planet.
Totally, totally. And don't even get me started on public transportation, especially in the United States. I hear you. And that's definitely a climate issue, hands down. I'm actually curious also, given your work now at HBAR Foundation, what do people usually get wrong about your work?
Think of when we talk about sustainability and ReFi and climate, we're often focused on just tokenization and that we're just focused on trading an asset. But the thing that we are so focused on is building a system that is objectively better than what existed yesterday. And it's not just objectively better for a financier, but it's objectively better for the person who is working day to day in environmental accounting, a carbon project, a developer, a auditor that is providing outcomes that average person who's working in a process that they maybe don't feel like they can always change because the systems have been inaccessible. We're building the systems to make that easier. It's not just about tokenization. It's about changing the system for the better for every person involved. Because if it only works for the financiers or someone who has the knowledge to participate in DeFi or is thinking about how do I get to the next positive financial outcome, that's not just what we do. It may be a side effect in some ways, but it's about making the lives better for every person involved in the climate value chain. And I think that's sometimes hard to see because everyone's focused on their, one part of the process or one part of the ecosystem, or maybe just coming into it new from a Web3 perspective and saying, this is difficult. This is too much. Why can't I tokenize this and trade this like something else? This is the ultimate Web3 problem, is this coordination problem across many parties to get to an asset or get to an outcome or get to an accounting point for decarbonization. And what we oftentimes think is it's just as simple as making a token, but it's actually coordinating that system that makes the token. That's what we do. And trying to make it better is our goal.
You mentioned two interesting things there, building something objectively better and also, people being focused on one specific thing as a potential issue. And what immediately came up to me was interoperability, right? Because interoperability obviously makes things better. I think interoperability is regenerative as well. And also it allows us to connect, the different pieces of the stack, different systems. But I feel like there's still a lack of it. And actually at DEF CON, it was also one of the big talking points. So I'm wondering what's Hedera's roadmap on, becoming more interoperable?
So in the blockchain sense, interoperability is obviously a big issue. We want to make sure that we're able to be interoperable, not just from a token perspective, but understanding how Hedera works. Hedera isn't a blockchain, it's a hash graph. So it's a distributed ledger technology or DAG in other terms. But it starts really with having parity from an EVM perspective on Hedera, and then it grows from there. We actually have partnerships with other chains where we're doing things like the DREC Alliance for decentralized recovery of keys. We're working on different leadership initiatives across the Web3 space there. And we're also working on making sure that we're, working with some of the bigger bridges out there to make sure the assets are interoperable. But at the end of the day, there's a bigger interoperability discussion that I also want to touch on because that was a buzzword at COP. But interoperability at COP means a very different thing than interoperability in a blockchain perspective. And what it generally means is I could have methodological interoperability, standard to standard to standard, totally different than the Web3 interoperability. It means that my credits, if I produce them from a host country, that those could go to a government to government opportunity in Article 6.2 at a registry, or I can go interoperably into the voluntary market of the Paris Agreement, Article 6.4, or the voluntary carbon market with standards like Vera, Gold Standard, Cert Carbano, and others. And I think that's interoperability is just as important. And I think it goes back to that point earlier from understanding, how do I make this consumable from a climate perspective? How do I make this data easily accessible? So we have kind of three tenets They're principles of when we give out grants. It's auditability, data or information discoverability, and then liquidity in that order. And if your information and data, whether it's a token, an audit trail, or something else, you can't reproduce it, it probably is not going to be interoperable. If the data can't become information that the average person can then understand how to use, it's definitely not going to be interoperable. And then you can't trade anything if you don't understand those two pieces, auditability and information discoverability to get to liquidity. And it doesn't matter if it's the carbon market at a standard or methodology or rules level, off ledgers and technology aside, or if it's a blockchain level. And interoperability is very important in that sense because it's not just a technology issue, it's actually a governance issue. And making sure that that governance issue is thoughtful, whether it's in climate or whether it's in technology or somewhere in between, that we need to think conscientiously about the systems that we're building to make sure that they work so the average person can understand them. Because I'd say that there's interoperability from a technologist perspective to a climate practitioner's perspective as well, which is really important.
You're speaking my language there, as technology does not exist in a vacuum. And going off of that, you as someone who's deeply involved in the tech ecosystem, do you ever worry about that this over reliance on technology, and that some may call technological determinism, especially quite prevalent, I would say, in the climate discussions, is actually damaging and can come at the expense of a deeper cultural change that we also need? What are your thoughts on that?
I think the idea that technology can solve everything is not the right way to think about it, because I can tell you that most of the folks who are using technology today, they're not thinking about the technology, they're thinking about the outcome that they're hoping to get. And technology is just a tool. And that's always been our view as folks who fund builders and fund open source code, is that technology has to make things objectively better. If you are 100% reliant on that technology, it's going to be really hard to say that the system's going to improve, because the technology is going to then dictate what the users do. And that's a scary thing. I think especially with AI, maybe more so than blockchains or public ledgers. My last role at Oracle was across blockchain, AI, and IoT. And I had a colleague who would say blockchain lowers the cost of trust, AI lowers the cost of prediction, and IoT lowers the cost of monitoring. But if you're using tools that just predict that you're hopefully going to be right, then your outcome hopefully will be right, but maybe not always right. If you're monitoring and trying to lower the cost of that, you have a sensor that only collects 5 data points, but it doesn't collect the context, which may tell a different story. It doesn't solve for everything. And blockchain lowers the cost of trust, but it doesn't always replace trust. And I think that's important to think about, is it can help you get there, but it doesn't get you there. And when we think about this in the context of climate, the Paris Agreement was not negotiated using technology. The governance of how we interact as different societies and hundreds of governments, 190 plus governments around the world, technology is part of the process, but it is not the process of what's right for folks who are from, 45 global South countries as part of the LDCs, the least developed countries. It's not necessarily right for the EU or US where I live. It's not necessarily right for the different negotiating blocks. And part of the reason I think I appreciate the necessity for an agreement like that is because technology doesn't lead the discussion. It's an enabler. And I think a lot of times in the Web3 world, we think about it maybe the other way around. We see the opportunity, and the opportunity is something we're chasing, but we don't always consider everything that's happening on the ground of where we're going to be enacting change or affecting change. And there's a lot of projects that, I can point to that say are thinking about things the other way around in the Web3 space. You can look at Gainforest, who's working a lot with countries who are based in, our countries and communities based in the global South, and they just won the X Prize for some of the work they're doing on bioacoustics with that in mind. But I think it's also important to know that those sensors are just part of that story. They're not the whole story. And I think they understand that. And that's something I really, greatly respect the work of David and his team. There's folks also in our community, for example, ATEC. So they're a cook stove project developer. They're based out of Australia, and they have work in Bangladesh and Cambodia. They just went live using the Hedera Guardian to actually connect cook stoves for cook stove carbon credits under the gold standard metered and measured methodology, where they're trying to trace the data the whole way through, but it's not the whole story. It's part of the story. And there's a bunch of other work that they do that help, use technology to make it easier, but it's not the whole of how that credit and those communities are impacted. Because in clean cooking, the technology just helps you monitor. It helps lower the cost of trust. But the fact that you're saving, with the electric stoves or oftentimes in clean cooking projects, you're saving energy. That's just a small portion of the story, but it's really saving time in cooking for women who are in global South countries. It's meaning that you don't pollute the home with open air fires. In many ways, the stove is the technology that's stopping air pollution. And that's a lot more important to the folks who are cooking than maybe the emission reduction that some corporation is then going to claim. And so I just link it back to those types of examples, because technology can't be the thing driving it. It's a tool so that I don't pollute the home, so that I can report this data at a lower cost, that I can trust the data, a little bit more. But it's about ultimately the impact that you're driving. And I think that's important, whether it's at a micro level like that or a macro level like the Paris Agreement.
I love hearing about these different use cases. But I'm curious because one of the big critiques of the refi space is okay, it's been around for a while, we have these great ideas, but it still hasn't been scaled. So, what do you think are some of the things that are holding the refi space back?
I want to go back to the point around just focusing on the token and going into what leads to the asset. I think that ReFi still exists, but I think a lot of folks have moved on from the branding because it was so focused on the financialization of assets. And I think there's a lot of folks who operate in ReFi who still work in climate, but they may be more focused on the data. And what I see happening is a shift as the industry becomes more mature of the financialization to the data, and they're still intertwined, but there may be less loud about that and more focused on trying to provide value to the folks that are going to become their customers. So as companies mature, instead of just putting their name out there, they're actually going and engaging with communities, and they're figuring out what's valuable to them. And I think that that's also brought a lot of new companies into the space who maybe don't identify as ReFi, but in many ways are participating in it. And when we had our event at COP, whether it's the folks like the big four auditors or folks like the traditional, emissions tracking and ESG reporting applications, you'll probably never hear, outside of the fact that they attended and spoke at our event, the words regenerative finance come out of their mouth. But in many ways, what I see is that they're enabling those types of assets, whether they're carbon emissions tokens, that they're then buying offsets or carbon credits from different project developers who are using all this Web3 technology. That I view that as ReFi, but we may just not call it that as much anymore. And I think that's really because it's focusing on the process and the data that leads to the assets. And those assets, going back to the platform, they're a tool. They're a tool to transmit and transfer value and transfer information that otherwise, wasn't possible. It wasn't very easy before. It wasn't easy to enable the trust around them. And I think that if we want to use different terms for that, that's okay. But I still call it ReFi. I just think it may be a different definition than the folks 2 years ago would look at and say, yeah, that's where I thought it was going to go. We had a retreat, it was called Greenhouse, and it was put on by the Regen network team and a few different parties in Colombia. And there were different working groups there as part of it. And some were focused on things like interoperability, some were focused on MRV, some were focused on different portions of the financial value chain, like carbon forwards. And many of those folks who are there, they're still working in the space. They're just doing a little bit of different things. And that's okay. And what I'd say is most of the folks who are there are passionate about driving change in the world. And I think that's really, if we were going to rebrand ReFi, what we should make it about, rather than the financialization of something. And if it becomes about driving change around climate impact and sustainability, I would say that, ReFi is a pretty good term for that. So
Wow, beautifully said. And your point about focusing on financialization and being loud rather than actually talking to communities and focusing and doing the work and making the impact. I think that's a great piece of advice to a lot of people out there working in the ReFi, even if they don't call it ReFi. But I'm curious, what other tips do you have for people who want to join the space, and how can we inspire more of these change makers? What advice would you give them?
the advice to every grantee that we give is don't pull too many cookies out of the cookie jar, otherwise you won't get any. And there's a lot of problems that we're going to have to rely on everyone else in a cooperative way to solve. But if we pick one area, then we can be a part of the ecosystem that solves it. And in our ecosystem, the reason why we focus so much on digital public goods is because that way our institutional knowledge is embedded in open source code that the next person can then pick up. And so instead of having to reinvent the wheel, learning from our past is the best way to avoid resolving the same problems that have already been solved. And the opportunity is if we rely on open source digital public goods, like the Hedera Guardian, and there's many others out there as well, that you can get ahead. And if you're saying, well, I'm not a developer, maybe I'm an environmental scientist, maybe I'm a financier, maybe I'm working marketing. There's all sorts of opportunities that in this space, you don't have to be technically, a developer to solve. If you can read a carbon markets methodology and you can take that data and translate it into an Excel sheet, there's ways to get that into tools that exist today. If you can do detailed write-ups and consultations about what's the impact of this methodology on the market, there's a role to play on commenting on the consultations that'll come out of the UN for the Paris Agreement. There's a role to play for a lot of folks, that don't just have technical skills. And oftentimes the folks who have those technical skills need help to translate that back into environmental language, into mass market language. And we need to keep working on bridging that gap so that what we're doing at the technical level through our grant funds for open source code meets the expectation of the market. And that's a thread that we want to keep pulling on to make sure that we're solving these problems.
Beautiful conclusion and a call to action for everybody out there to keep building those bridges. And that's part of the mission here at the ReFi podcast. So thank you for inspiring us and our listeners. And as we conclude today's episode, we always ask our guests a set of rapid fire questions. So feel free to be brief. Are you ready?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, the first question is, what book are you currently reading?
I'm going to give a shout out. A Mongolian delegation gave me a book on Mongolia at COP, the one I've been working through. So I'm going to say that they're encouraging as we have there's different COPs, one on biodiversity, one on carbon and climate change. There's a COP to combat desertification that's happening in Mongolia next year. And so I'll give a shout out to the Mongolian delegation who's trying to inform the world about the urgent issues in desertification that they're facing. So,
Love that. What's your favorite thing about your work?
I love trying to tackle the difficult systemic challenges across multiple stakeholders, but where if we can build those bridges and provide tools to build bridges that didn't exist, that aha moment is something I would like to work for. When someone who couldn't get a carbon credit from project to VBB, which is something that we recently had an aha moment with. That's what we build for. That's what we give out grants for, is to build those bridges and to make sure that we can help folks get to value where they've previously been blocked. That's something that makes me excited. So,
And the final rapid fire question is, what's one quote, lesson, or mantra that has shaped you most as a person?
when you wake up in the morning, everyone puts their pants on the same way that you do. So don't be intimidated by the challenges of the day.
That's awesome. Love that. That's a great conclusion, Wes. And thank you so much for joining us on this show. I really liked your, strategic, well thought out approach. And I can see that you're playing the long-term game. And I think that's very refi because, working on your economic system doesn't happen overnight. So kudos to you. And hopefully we can catch up in the future and see how your work advances.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here. And for anyone who wants to get in touch afterwards, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I have a Twitter as well. Geisenberger Wes is a handle. Or if you're interested in learning more about the fund, feel free to apply at hbarfoundation.org/apply. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Wes. It was a pleasure.